The ESF and the CIA go wild fighting the Cold War. To learn about the history of the CIA, I recommend Legacy of Ashes, a book by New York Times reporter Tim Weiner. Weiner has been working on Legacy of Ashes for 20 years. He has read over 50,000 government documents, 2,000 oral histories, and has conducted 300 on-the-record interviews. This is as factual as you can get. Weiner has also won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the intelligence community. Despite the vast resources at its disposal, the CIA has largely been a failure. First, it is no good at espionage. In a typical example, the agency dropped millions of dollars worth of gold bars, arms, two-way radios, and agents into Poland to support a powerful Polish underground movement that didn't exist. 5 years of planning, various agents, and millions of dollars down the drain. On the clandestine side, the human costs were far higher. The CIA has secretly supported fascists, militarists, murderers, death squads, and religious fanatics. The agency's official history could be written in blood, not ink. In Iran, a CIA coup initiated a period of 25 years of repression and torture. In Guatemala, a CIA-organized coup initiated 40 years of military government death squads, torture, disappearances, and mass executions. In Indonesia, it waged a full-scale war against the government, including bombing runs by American pilots. In Laos, the CIA was repeatedly involved in coups and created a clandestine army to overthrow the government. In Ecuador, the CIA ousted President Velasco. In Congo, the CIA installed Mobutu Seko, who ruled with a level of corruption and cruelty that shocked even his CIA handlers. The list goes on. Because the agency operates in secret, most Americans are unaware of the crimes being perpetrated in their names. The deaths from these armed assaults run into the millions. To learn more about this dark history, go to Google Archive News. There has been nothing, no matter how terrible, that the ESF has not been willing to finance. There is unfortunately one area the agency excelled. Through the CIA, the ESF has decades of experience with undermining democracy. In Japan, for example, the CIA entrenched the Liberal Democratic Party in power and turned Japan into a single-party state, which it remains to this day. The other thing the CIA was good at was hiding its own incompetence. Even when the CIA seemed to fail at everything it undertook, the ability to represent failure as success was becoming a CIA tradition. The ESF-CIA set up a worldwide propaganda network. The US engaged in a propaganda war against the Soviet Union. And so it built a worldwide propaganda network, which ranged in importance from Radio Free Europe to a third-string guy in Quito. The network was known to those inside the CIA as Wisner's Wurlitzer, named after Frank Wisner and the Wurlitzer organ. Almost at the push of a button, the Wurlitzer became the means for orchestrating in almost any language anywhere in the world whatever tune the CIA was in the mood to hear. The agency's long-standing relationship with American journalists was first called to public attention in 1973. That led to investigations by 2 congressional committees. Let's look at the final report of one of those committees. What interests us is Part 10 on the domestic impact of CIA operations. The variety of CIA relationships with the US media makes a systematic breakdown almost impossible. The CIA is now using several hundred American academics who write books and other materials for propaganda purposes. In the world of covert propaganda, book publishing activities have a special place. A single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and actions to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium. Well over 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored. I have a particular hatred for the book form of propaganda. If anyone thinks the financial crisis was caused by Wall Street greed, please watch my video on the true cause of the crisis. The danger of CIA propaganda contaminating US media occurs in virtually any instance of propaganda use. In the case of books, substantial fallout in the United States may be a necessary part of the propaganda process. An American that reads one of these books would not know that his thoughts and opinions are being shaped by an agency of the United States government. The CIA failed to reveal the names of propaganda books published since 1967. In fact, the CIA wasn't cooperative in anything with regard to its media relationships. Carl Bernstein from the Watergate scandal explained why in his cover story published in 1977. Because, from the CIA's point of view, this was the highest and most sensitive covert program of all, the CIA went went to extraordinary lengths to hide its media relationships. The CIA persuaded the committee to restrict its inquiry and to deliberately misrepresent the actual scope of the activities in its final report. Obscuring the facts was simple. No mention was made of the 400 summaries. Instead, the report noted blandly that some 50 recent contacts with journalists had been studied, thus conveying the impression that the agencies dealing with the press had been limited to those instances. Even while the Senate Intelligence Committee was holding its hearings, the CIA continued to maintain ties with 75 to 90 journalists of every description. As Bernstein discovered after 6 months of research, more than 400 American journalists have secretly carried out assignments for the CIA. Some of the journalists were Pulitzer Prize winners, distinguished reporters. To a degree never widely suspected, the CIA has concentrated its relationships with journalists in the most prominent sectors of the American press corps. In other words, the big names in news. That means people like Brian Williams and Katie Couric. Go to my entry on the Nightly News for an example on how bad the situation is. In response to Bernstein's article, the New York Times wrote a 3-part series on the CIA's propaganda network, and that was the last we ever heard of the issue. Some interesting things were written in this series. At least 18 American reporters have refused CIA offers, some of which were quite lucrative. At least 22 American news organizations have employed American journalists who were working for the CIA. These include some of the most influential news organizations in America. Major outlets like Time, Newsweek, CBC News, and the Times itself were the most extensively used. The Times unearthed several occasions where the CIA had interfered with the paper's reporting, including in 1954, when the CIA overthrew the government of Mexico, and a Times reporter was getting too close to discovering its role. The New York Times also shows how the CIA suppresses undesired information. The CIA seriously considered a plan to buy up the entire first printing of a book to keep it from the public view. When that didn't work, a propaganda campaign was initiated to encourage reviewers to denigrate the book. A large part of the CIA's effort at domestic censorship was aimed at news accounts of its own operations. Finally, take a look at the CIA Report on Openness from 1992, which shows that the Wurlitzer is alive and well. The CIA's Public Affairs Office now has relationships with reporters from every major newswire service, newspaper, newsweekly, and television network in the nation. In many instances, the CIA has persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold, or even scrap stories. This has helped the agency change some intelligence failure stories into intelligence success stories. The ESF's twisted logic. Consider this. First, the Fed has established currency swaps on the ESF's behalf. Swaps are a type of derivative. Second, the ESF intervenes mainly in the forward market through the New York Fed. Forwards are also derivatives. Now, on the New York Fed's website, it states, the Fed historically has not engaged in forward or other derivative transactions. This lie is produced by the ESF's twisted logic. You see, anything the Fed does on the ESF's behalf doesn't officially happen. This same logic applies to other agencies. For example, the CIA doesn't need to tell Congress about anything funded directly by the ESF. Now take this twisted logic in the context of journalists paid by the CIA. In 1976, CIA announced it would no longer enter into paid relationships with journalists. But what about the ESF? Well, in 1971, the ESF had 300 people on a payroll of 5 million. And in 1976, the ESF had 500 people on a payroll of 10 million. That's quite a big jump, isn't it? This propaganda network has always been financed by the ESF. Taking the CIA out of the equation doesn't change much. The ESF spends the entire US gold reserves. What happens when you give people who believe they have a self-appointed mission of world-shaking importance all control over US gold reserves? Well, they knew the answer to this question back in 1939. Senator Glass, a critic of the ESF, explains what the government would do. You would just go ahead and spend that money, and then borrow more on top of it. To demonstrate what would happen to the dollar, he held up a bundle of German marks. You have to understand that owning gold was only illegal for Americans. Foreigners were not prohibited from asking for, receiving, and owning gold instead of holding on to dollars. So when the ESF delivered suitcases filled with cash to foreign politicians, it was spending America's gold. This was a big deal. Because the supply of gold is limited, its value is steady over long periods of time. On the other hand, the supply of paper currencies, like the dollar, is not limited, so they lose value against gold, or crash completely. By 1956, America's gold hoard was too small to back the dollar. The ESF was spending money as though the sky was the limit. Using the IMF and the World Bank, the ESF went wild financing CIA Cold War activity. This massive spending turned the balance of payments negative. These deficits were badly damaging the dollar. Other countries were building up claims against US gold. The outcome of the ESF's foreign aid was obvious. By 1960, the US gold supply was down to 18 billion against 19 billion in foreign claims. The United States was essentially broke. The gold outflow begins. The gold outflow began in 1958. America's foreign aid and military security programs started the gold trickling outwards. It swelled to almost torrential proportions in 1960. The situation had begun to cause panic. Confidence in the greenback was failing. The dollar, the U.S. economy, and the world monetary system were in danger of collapsing. This was a problem. You see, on the day the dollar crashes, the entire world will focus on the agency that was supposed to protect its value. How do you think Americans, with their retirement savings wiped out, living through the Second Great Depression, would feel about Project Artichoke, a 15-year, multi-billion-dollar search for ways to control the human mind? I think the American people would be quite angry about how the ESF wasted the US's monetary wealth, and a lot of people would end up in jail for a very long time. So people at the Treasury started defending the dollar like their lives depended on it, because they did.